My name is Nicky Harman. I'm delighted to be here as part of this event. The event, I should explain, is part of the National Centre for Writing's Meet the World series. And we've got two brilliant translators here. We're going to be having a discussion about the works that they have translated. Before we start, I'm going to say a big thank you to the National Arts Council, Singapore, for supporting this event. So our two translators, Wai-chew is Associate Professor of English in the School of Humanities, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and is a noted Chinese to English translator whose research interests include post-colonial literature, Southeast Asian literature, translingual writing and translation practice. Wai-chew has written a number of articles which have been published in journals and has also recently published a reference work entitled Singapore Comparative Literature Compendium with Balestier 2021. And most important of all for today's event, he is the translator in residence at the National Centre for Writing in Norwich. Daniel Eltringham is a writer, editor and translator based in Bristol, UK, is writing a book about translations of Latin American guerrilla poetry from 1960 to 1990. And I hope you're going to tell us a bit more about that, Daniel. His prize-winning first book, Poetry and Commons, Post-War and Romantic Lyric in Times of Enclosure, is out with Liverpool University Press 2022. And he's had a lot of poetry and translations and co-translations, which have appeared in a number of different magazines, as well as two anthologies of poetry and translation. I think you'll find their fuller biogs online and on the YouTube channel. So I think I'll stop there. And, oh yes, a bit about myself. My name is Nicky Harman. I translate from Chinese to English and have done for a number of years. I'm a trustee and volunteer worker on Paper Republic. That's paper-republic.org, which is a registered charity, not-profit organization promoting Chinese translation, Chinese writing in English translation. So apart from translating, I work on Paper Republic, I do mentoring and a small amount of teaching. So that's me. I'm not going to say very much more, except to throw out questions to our two participants. So, hello Wai-chew, hello Daniel. Wai-chew, could you tell us something about the author that you've been translating most recently, that you and I have discussed in some depth over the last few months, Hai Fan? Who is he and what are his stories about?
Well, he's a Singapore writer. He writes in Chinese. When he was a young man, he went off to join the guerrilla struggle known as the Second Malayan Emergency. So the first Malayan Emergency was 1948 to 1960. And then the second one, there was a hiatus at 1968 to 1989. So he joined the second one and he fought with them from 1976 to 1989 until the end of it. It ended in 1989. There was an agreement signed called the Hat Yai Agreement. Hat Yai is a small town. It's a town in southern Thailand. So the Malayan Communist Party signed the agreement, and the Malaysian and Thai governments also signed the agreements. Then, and as a result, they put down their arms, and they came back to civilian life. So out of that experience, he's written what we might call rainforest literature. He's written in his Hai Fan is a pseudonym. He's written 2 short story collections and 1 novel. His novel Yuling the Beiting, The Background to the Forest, was published this year. His first short story collection was published in 2017, Delicious Hunger. I think that's going to be published next year in translation, in English translation by Tilted Axis, from what I know. And then I'm working on his second short story collection, and that one came out in 2021. And that one is basically what you might call a bestiary. A bestiary, I think that's the word. So bestiary is, I think, a genre that goes back to the Middle Ages. It's a collection of short descriptions of animals, and real and imaginary. And he's given a twist to it. So he's got these short story collections, and all of them are named after animals. One of them, so like these 12 short stories, you've got muntjac, python, black bear, squirrel, mouse deer, elephant, mountain tortoise, tiger, hornbill, cuckoo bird, wild boar, and gibbon. These are the 12 stories there, and each of them are prefaced by one-page vignette giving the Latin name, the ranging habits, the foraging habits, the reproduction practices, and other biological details of the animal in question. After which the story proper begins. So I don't know whether you can see from here, but so this is the one from muntjac. Muntjac is a small deer that's indigenous to Southeast Asia. So he gives what you might call the biological details, the objectivist description, and there's even a Latin name. Muntjac, I think when it gets alarmed, it calls out. Its call sounds like the bark of a dog, so it's also called the barking deer. So each story is prefaced by something like this, just a little preface giving the objectivist information about the animal in question. So here you've got a python, and then there's a bit of a description. And then after the scientific description, the natural science description, the story proper begins. So for me, I think the heart of it is this encouragement to move beyond understanding of animals and the creatures of the wild as entirely just animals understood in a natural science way. I think he's trying to say that humankind's relationship with nature is properly existentialist. It's not objectivist, it's not scientistic. Our relationship with nature is properly existentialist. So the different stories give us a picture of the relationship that protagonists have with these animals. So the last one, gibbon, it involves a gibbon, a monkey that saved the life of the protagonist and his friend. And then the story elephant involves the protagonist thinking about the ethics of eating his elephants. They're trapped in the highlands. They don't have any food, so they have to eat it. But it thinks about the ethics involved in this, in what happens when you kill higher sentient animals that share some human attributes like memory and deep feeling. So all of the stories have this relationship with the animal in question. So it's encouraging us to move beyond the objectivist scientistic idea about animals.
Thank you very much. Would you like to give us a short reading from one of those essays, stories?
Okay, sure. I'll read a bit of the original from the first short story, muntjac. That's the barking deer. I'll read a bit in Chinese, and then I'll try to share screen if possible, and just read the English translation. I'll read more from the English translation, so the Chinese one will just be a sample of his writing.
Okay.
客定兴奋的解下背带的绳子，突然啪一响，眼前光影一闪，黄几竟从钢索中脱逸，那只吊棍挺立直指天空，雾质微微发颤，十几米来的矮青一阵破啦啦纷乱摇晃，然后恢复原来样子。丛林里有隐隐的风声，发生的在眼前的一幕，竟然像梦境 是的不真实. And so that's the Chinese. And then I don't know if I can get the English, a bit of the English translation on the screen. This is a portion where the protagonist is out checking on the traps with an indigenous protagonist who is also a fighter. He's because it wasn't just Chinese background people who fought in this Malayan emergency. There was also indigenous people involved. There were also Malay population, Malay ethnicity people involved. So he's been learning a lot about from Kerting is a Chinese background protagonist. He's been learning a lot about foraging and about animals. And this guy Anna is the indigenous character. So he's teaching him lots of things like there's this plant that you can pluck and you can put in your mouth. It's like chewing gum, or it's like a mint, and you can suck on it. And if it's sour, that's fine. But if it's bitter or sweet, you shouldn't taste that. You should throw it away. So he's learning quite a lot of these things. And then at this point, they come upon a muntjac trapped in a barking deer trapped in one of the traps, and he wants to chase after it. But Anna cautions him to say he shouldn't chase after it. I'll just read from the translation. Filled with excitement, Kerting unshouldered his rucksack and opened it. From inside, he pulled out a coil of rope that he had prepared earlier. Suddenly, they heard a loud popping sound. In an instant, the muntjac broke free. The sapling that provided the anchor point now pointed skywards and was no longer caught in an arc. It vibrated slightly in the air. A 10-meter stretch of the undergrowth went fa-la-la-la, fa-la-fa-la as the animal dashed away. Then everything returned to its customary stillness. The gentle forest breeze, what they just witnessed, everything felt unreal and dreamlike. They checked the trap. The steel noose was still intact. It wasn't broken and still hung in its original position. Held tightly in its grip, however, was a 10-inch section of foreleg and deer hoof. Kerting had heard before that, in extremis, certain creatures could break their legs and make good an escape. He didn't expect to witness it himself. He didn't expect that an animal as docile as the muntjac could pull off such a trick. Fresh meat dropped into a cooking pot can actually spring up and run away. A rush of indignation hit Kerting as a thought came to him. Let's chase after it, he said. With a broken leg, it can't go far. There'll be a trail of blood. But Anna didn't utter a sound. He retrieved the broken hoof from the noose and turned it over a few times in his hands, inspecting it carefully. The hoof was covered with fine, golden brown hair. In the middle, they could see the white bone with a piece of tendon still attached to it, lined with streaks of blood. Come on, let's go, Kerting cried. No good, no good, Anna said, waving his hands. If we chase after it, there'll be danger. Huh? I tell you, it's real. My brother experienced it himself. One time he was chasing after a porcupine, following his footprints. Do you know what happened? Anna stopped moving altogether. A look of wonder came into his eyes. He gave a short breath. My brother saw 3 porcupine quills stuck into the fruit of a jackfruit tree standing next to him. The porcupine blasted its quills at him and it went into the fruit. Dada said before that when pushed into a state of desperation, animals were used as special life-saving weapons. He weighed the broken hoof in the palm of his hands. The muntjac will also certainly have such a weapon. Kerting didn't know whether he should believe what he just heard. Anna had discarded the artfulness that usually adorned his face. He had shifted into a state of trepidation, but one that also contained a sense of reverence. It looked like Kerting didn't have a choice. He had to believe him. Okay, I'll stop there.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. And I if I could just explain a bit, I think he's trying to say at some level that we get from the indigenous people, not just the traditional ecological knowledge, not just pharmaceutical type of knowledge about a plant that you can eat and you can commercialize it, for instance, but also maybe the mythology. What's the place of, for instance, mythology in forest sustainability? Is it possible that we listen to these stories and we learn to re-enchant nature. Right? Modernity, I think the sociologist Weber tells us, it disenchants nature. So can art re-enchant nature? Can it teach us what is the role of myths and ritualistic beliefs? What role do they play in the maintenance of forest sustainability? So that to me is important because it's telling us that we need to learn from these small eco footprint indigenous cultures. And I think the indigenous theories like to say that our past is your future. They like to tell modern people that our past is your future. And it is our future. If we don't learn to live, to make our footprint smaller, then everything falls apart in a kind of ecocide. So to me, that's the importance of his writing.
Lovely. And now, Daniel, can I ask you to say something about Mario Payeras and his work as a poet and ecologist?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say that was absolutely fantastic, and I can see loads and loads of parallels. So that's great. So yeah, Mario Payeras. Then he was a Guatemalan guerrilla leader, an intellectual, writer, poet. He's not well known outside of Guatemala, so I'll give a brief sketch of his life. He was born in Chimaltenango, which is in Guatemala, in 1940. And he died in exile in Chiapas, Mexico, in 1996. And he studied philosophy at the St. Carlos University in Guatemala, and as well as at major public institutions in Mexico, and also in Leipzig in East Germany. And this is a famous kind of time in the 60s where there was this like intense cultural exchange between Latin American intellectuals and the communist world. And he gets back from a trip to Cuba in 68. And he co-founds the EGP, which is the Guerrilla Army of the Poor, one of the many sort of insurgencies that are springing up at this time. And as part of this insurgency, he just like Haifan, actually in the mid-70s goes to the Guatemalan rainforest to live in the forest and to undergo a very kind of similar process, I think, of education, spiritual and intellectual change that now He goes to live in the Ixcan forest, which is near the Mexican border, with the guerrilla group that he's co-founded. And it's a land of cloud forests and quetzal birds, but also brutal racist violence against the Maya populations, and also kind of state-sponsored and corporate ecocide, deforestation, etc. And for Payeras, I think it's really important to keep in mind that these elements, ecology and political struggle, are really inseparable for him for the rest of his writing career. And so when he's in the forest, he writes this collection of poems. As guerrilla intellectuals, kind of middle-class intellectuals who join up, they often end up writing poetry, partly because it's a very portable genre, and you can kind of scribble a poem on a piece of paper and put it in your knapsack, and it doesn't get in the way too much. So he writes this amazing collection of poems called Poems of the Zona Reina. The Zona Reina is the name of one of the municipalities of Quiché, which is where the Ixcan is located. And I love these poems, and I've been translating them alongside his hybrid lyrical essay, Latitude of Flower and Hail, which was written later in 1988. And I'll say more about the environmental commitments when I introduce that translation in a while. And together, I think it's important to say that these texts complement his really famous book, the only famous book he has, really, which is this prose testimonial account of the Guatemalan guerrilla, Days of the Jungle, Los Días de la Selva, which was translated by the leftist publisher Monthly Review back in the 80s in this handsome red and green edition. And as far as I know, nothing else by Payeras has been translated, and there's a lot in a lot of different genres out there. So I think I'm making a start. So I will read extracts from both, but I'll start with the poems. So I'm going to read two of the short poems I translated from Poemas de la Zona Reina. They both sort of describe life in the jungle with a blend of kind of, I suppose, like utopian optimism, but also self-satire. And this is very characteristic, I think, of Payeras' voice. This sort of blend of commitment and irony mixed with environmental concerns. I suppose a kind of ironic orientation towards the idea that a ragged group of idealists could somehow take over the state and kind of remake social and ecological life in the country. It's sort of both thinkable at this point, but also kind of unthinkable. And then the sense that they were profoundly changed by the experience of living in nature, as in the case of Haifan's work. So I'll read this first one in Spanish as well, and it's really kind of going into the rainforest and what it's like, and it being a kind of forgetting, a kind of ritual of forgetting, and a kind of remaking of the self, I suppose. This is Zona Reina. No recordamos ya como éramos al principio, porque con cada día parte un cadáver nuestro a pudrirse en el tiempo. Nuestros mejores esbozos de la humanidad futura resultaron apenas artificios de pólvora que ardieron bajo la lluvia de la primera noche. Porque aquí la realidad todavía está en guerra con los pájaros, e ignora por lo tanto las cristalizaciones de la decrepitud y los tardíos laberintos en que suele extraviarse su mudanza. Y agreguemos, nunca como estas mañanas estuvimos tan exentos de los envejecimientos del espíritu, ni nuestros pensamientos se parecieron tanto a nuestros actos. Okay, so then the English is, already we've forgotten how we were at the start. For each day, one of our corpses departs and goes bad eventually. Our best drafts of future humanity turned out little more than gunpowder tricks, snuffed out by the rain on the first night. Because here, reality is still at war with the birds, and so knows nothing of the crystallizations of decay and the latter-day labyrinths through which its change leads itself astray. And let us add, we were never so free of the aging of the spirit as these mornings, nor did our thoughts so resemble our acts. The second poem is similar. It's another kind of jungle poem. It's called Sierra of Chama. And it goes like this. We have come to a world forgotten by planes and birds. For 20 months our little troop dragged its flashy gear through the jungle. 3 ships' masts, acrobats' trapezes, and a tattered tent. 2 old elephants, a whale with a tail battered by the ingratitude of matter, and other artifacts that bring joy. We who survived the last deluge have learned to find our way by memories, because it's already many months since we heard word of the sun. And in order to see Orion tracing his pirouettes in the sky like a melancholy aircraft, it is necessary to wait for sun's dotage. Still, a handful of worm-ridden Bolsheviks had never been so close to throwing down the reinforced law that governed the making of all goods. We learned 2 more things in the rain. Any mortal first has the right, at least, to a big orange, and any sorrow to a morning at the fair, so that life may be, one time, like a flower or a song. Okay. So those are those 2 poems.
Yeah, that's lovely. Okay, well, the next thing that I'd actually like to ask Wai-chew is, I've read, I think now, 3 of the stories that you've translated, and I think you mentioned this when you were introducing Haifan, that the way in which he talks about the jungle and the people and the animals in the jungle, it kind of reflects on the eye of the observer. The eye of the observer sees the jungle and the local people in a very different way from what we would expect. And he also reflects on animal behavior and the way in which that contrasts with human behavior. For instance, the mothers, the young women who've had to leave their children behind to go and fight, contrasted with the animals who will stay with their babies even if it means their own death. I wonder if Wai-chew, if you'd like to say something about that. Do you think it's at all judgmental, or is he just observing?
I don't think it's judgmental. I mean, I think I'll read a bit of it later on. This short story, Black Bear, which deals with this issue. Both protagonists, they are tasked to go out to check on the traps that they've laid, and one of them is actually very skilled, and the other one is less skilled. So and both of them had children, and subsequently they had to give them up because you can't join the struggle if you have children. So it speaks to the extent of the sacrifice that they made. Part of this is just historical retrieval, telling us that there were women participants in the struggle, and their stories are important. So this short story, Black Bear, that I'll read a bit later on. There's two women fighters who belong to this agricultural group, and they've got to work to grow crops to feed their unit, and at the same time, one day they are tasked to go out to go and check on the traps, and they find out that there's a bear in one of the traps, and one of them shoots it. She shoots it, and then they realize that it's actually a smaller bear. It's an offspring. There's probably a mother somewhere, and they are sure that the mother will return, because the animal behavior is different from human behavior. But so the next day, the protagonist who shot the bear goes back to check on the trap to see whether the mother bear has returned. Well, the second protagonist isn't able to go along because she's been given sentry duty, and it's one of those duties that you can't shirk. You have to do sentry duty. So she stands sentry. She observes, and it's a security thing. You have to watch out to see whether things are okay, whether you might be being infiltrated by the enemy, etc. So what she tends to do when she's on sentry duty, she starts to think about her life, and she thinks about the fact that she had a child with her partner. And that's another thing that we don't really hear about the struggle, is that they had partners. You could express your feelings for someone, and you are given a chance to be a couple. They set up a hut, and then you could spend a matrimonial night together. So you had those kinds of relationships, and apparently she had lost her couple. They had a child, and then later on, about 5 years in the past, she lost her partner, and then she doesn't even have a picture of him. All she has are memories. So as she ponders some of these experiences, she also recalls that her colleague, the other lady who shot the bear, also had an experience where she also lost a child. This was about 12 years ago, and then the unit allowed her to meet the child subsequently in the narrative present. But the child, when they meet up, it is I think he was brought up by an aunt or something like that. The child doesn't want to greet the parent, doesn't want to greet this lady who is fighting in the struggle. He says that if you gave birth to me, why did you not bring me up? So there's this kind of sacrifices that the text wants to say that these people made. The people who lay down their lives, parents who had to give up their children, and at some level, this is part of the historical retrieval of this struggle. I don't know whether the same applies to Payeras, and the work of some of these people in the Latin America situation. In Singapore, which is a very pro-business environment, all of this is seen as the bandits. You can't express in polite company. You don't really express a sense of support for the Malayan emergency, the first or second one. Even though the first one probably hastened the transition towards a civilian government, they weren't able to overturn colonial government. But the first Malayan emergency between 1948 and 1960 probably hastened the transfer of power to a post-colonial indigenous population, right? So the second Malayan emergency is a bit more problematic because by then you had local leaders and still continue with the struggle. So all of this is wrapped up in how people are kind of encouraged to think about these people and this part of our history. That basically this is these people are bandits. I don't know whether the same applies to the Latin American situation. So by writing about it, by giving us an idea of the sacrifices that they made, she's also engaging in a retrieval of history. But the main thing about his work, and which has been commented upon by other writers, including Malaysian writers, Malaysian writers who are based in Taiwan, for instance, who are also trying to bring up this historical period to retrieve the history. They've noted that it's not ideological, it's nuanced. I think like the Payeras story, that poems that Daniel just read, right? There's a great understanding of the scale of the challenge that you're facing, and they don't see themselves as heroes, but they just want to do a bit of historical retrieval. So it's not being judgmental at all. It's just sharing these experiences, but with the focus on ecological experiences. And the main part of this experience is that at the end, when the mother comes to the trap, they set up a trap again, and the mother comes the next day. And while she's on sentry duty, she hears the shot, and that means that the mother was killed. And what they're going to do is they're going to cut off the paws of these bears, and they're going to give it out to the agricultural team. There's 8 of them, so just 2 bears, 8 paws, and it's considered to be like a great privilege to have this. But the protagonist, who was on sentry duty, she decides that she's not going to cook the bear paw and use it as a tonic. And in this way, they're also questioning traditional folk beliefs in East Asian culture, that that you eat some of these animal parts, that there's great tonic, nutritive powers. So she's also questioning that, and I think that's also very important that you are questioning some of these feudal beliefs, and you're using it to say that. So she gives up her portion of this bear paw. She says, why don't you have it, or give it to the others, right? So the animals are still killed for their meat, and the reason for that is also because there's a cordon sanitaire around the fossils. They've been chased up into the jungle, into the highlands. They don't have contact with the rural population. They don't have food, so they basically have to rely on hunting and gain meat. But in this case, the woman decides that she would not imbibe the bear paw because she disagrees with this traditional folk beliefs, and that's part and parcel of what he's trying to do, to say those beliefs are wrong. So there's questioning of some of these beliefs. There's no judgment, not at all.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Daniel, do you want to say anything about Payeras?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a couple of points there. I mean, definitely like the sort of relationship with indigenous cultures and indigenous knowledges and mythologies is also there in Payeras, and he's very, very aware of this, a lot more aware than most of the Latin American guerrilla writers, who are usually fairly blind to that context, I would say. And in Days of the Jungle, he's very much explicitly saying, look, we're trying to inscribe the Mayan populations into the struggle, and they do very successfully, which has terrible consequences for the Maya villages, and the kind of genocidal counterinsurgency and the reprisals happen in the 1980s. It's really terrible. They wipe out whole villages. But at the same time, he's saying very explicitly, like, that in order to be able to live in the jungle, we have to learn from people who know how to live there. And this is partly about, as Wai-chew was saying, it's partly a kind of question of practical knowledge, but it's also a question of kind of spiritual and existential reorientation, right? And then I think in answer to your question about the status of these struggles in Latin America, I think I can definitely see that that there's a resonance there, in the sense that, I think in a lot of Latin American countries, there is this view of the leftist struggles as having been defeated, and no one really wants to talk about it. But at the same time, there's a certain glamour, right, which comes from the kind of the era of Che Guevara, and to some extent, the Zapatistas in Chiapas today. There's a certain kind of fashionable quality to those struggles. So they kind of move between being kind of, as you say, kind of unspeakable and kind of unmentionable in kind of hyper-capitalist environments, but also having a kind of cachet, which I think is interesting.
Does Payeras also, because I haven't read as much of his work, does he also talk about or highlight the sacrifices, the human, what the fighters sacrificed, especially the women? Because I think that's something that's very interesting in Haifan and deeply moving. He's working within it. I suppose what the first thing to say is he's working within an already established genre of particular tropes by the time we get to the 70s. So in terms of kind of relation to nature and this kind of trope of going to the mountain or going to the jungle, he's talking about he's kind of critiquing a trope that's already quite established, in the sense that, yes, the guerrilla soldier will go and it's an act of sacrifice. It's a kind of quasi-religious idea of sort of self-abnegation and self-transformation and ritual sort of purgation in a way, because you live in these conditions of privation and you're kind of spiritually reborn through struggle, I suppose is the idea. And I think Payeras' perspective in the 70s is a bit more ironic than that, because he's seen the insurgencies of the 60s who followed the Cuban example. They all kind of failed miserably, largely, and most of the young, promising writers and intellectuals were killed very, very, very young. So his perspective, I think, is more practical, and it's what and I think the concern for ecology and environment and sustainable living in alongside the Maya peoples, I think, comes out of a concern with making the insurgencies more practically successful on one hand, but also more, in terms of the way that they relate to the jungle, or the rainforest or the mountain, sort of more ethically correct as well. He's very concerned with this, and I think I think this really comes out in the sense in his emphasis, which you get across a lot of this literature, on seeing the rainforest as a kind of teacher, as a kind of pedagogical relationship, where you're kind of learning from the kinds of knowledge and the kinds of experience that allow you to survive in those environments. It's the rainforest is a sort of harsh teacher in a way, but it establishes a dialogue with both. You could say like the ideas of radical pedagogy that were circulating at that time by someone like Paulo Freire, the pedagogy of the oppressed, but also revising and challenging orthodox Marxist approaches, exactly as Wai-chew, because of contact with the indigenous peoples, right? And their cosmovisions and their knowledges. And I think it's complicated and interesting in those ways. Yeah. The next question that I'd like to put to both of you, perhaps you'd like to say something at this point about how influential are his ideas nowadays, Payeras? Are they still influential? Have they evolved? Is there anything has he influenced other contemporary writers?
It's a really good question. He's not well known outside Guatemala and maybe bits of Mexico where he was living, where he lived in exile, and perhaps Central America. But I mean, he's certainly influential within Guatemala, is what I say. But I think, as Wai-chew was saying, he was also suppressed. There's an interesting story about his tomb, which is that he was buried in Chiapas alongside the tomb of Yon Sosa, who was another Guatemalan guerrilla leader, and his remains were stolen very, very soon after burial, and they were taken away, and nobody knows where to. And the assumption is that this is a kind of belated tale of Cold War Gothic in a way. The Cold War was sort of carried on after his death through this act of tomb raiding. So there is a sense in which he's influential in the sense that the authorities wanted to suppress the memory of him, even to the point of kind of stealing his bones. But I think I think that there is at the moment a kind of academic interest, certainly in Payeras. Diana Mendez in Mexico is a historian who's been doing some great work on his kind of agrarian thought. Cornelia Grabner is a literary scholar who's also been working with his archives in Mexico City. So I think that there is a moment of sort of returning to Payeras.
Great, yeah. Well, same question to Wai-chew. What about Hai-san? How influential or not do you think he is nowadays?
Well, I think what Daniel's talking about, the work that we do, it also helps to keep alive the work that they did, the sacrifices that they made, and if bringing it to an English-speaking population, helps to keep alive the spirit. It keeps the torch alive, so to speak. So even if the work has an ironic gloss to it, that there is that importance. That's why we spend our time doing this work instead of having a drink at a bar. I think all this is important. I think the Hai-fan in this case, the first short story collection came out in 2017. It was selected by Asia Weekly, which is Yatou Zoukan, which is a Hong Kong-based magazine. That said that it was 10 best prose texts of the year or something. So that's like an encomium that appears in, let's say, Time or Newsweek, and it puts, for me at least, it puts Southeast Asian Sinophone literature on the map. It says that Sinophone literature isn't just China and Taiwan and Hong Kong; it's also Southeast Asia, and it says that I think it's important for the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia. It says that we laid down roots. Look, we even fought for independence. We fought in the struggles, and we're not just obsessed with running provision shops and doing business. We put our roots in this region and we fight for its local struggles. So I think for the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia, that's important of itself. But on top of that, I think it is an ecological aspect to it. I think that there isn't that much ecological writing, I think, in Southeast Asia, and so this and it is important, because it puts across the idea of spaceship Earth. You know, the idea that we only have Earth as a spaceship. Partly because of the historical circumstances, these people were forced to can rely on game meat and to learn from the indigenous people, because there's a military cordon sanitaire thrown around them, and the Malaysian Chinese rural population was sequestered in fenced-in compounds. They were called euphemistically new villages. They were fenced in by barbed wire. So I don't think it was as brutal as South America. I don't think it was at that level. But because they had to rely on the jungle, so they became a kind of a microcosm for me of this idea of spaceship Earth, and they had to learn from the indigenous people. So they had to put aside some of the prejudices that they might have from a perspective of socialist modernity. So all of that, I think, is worth preserving. And so the influence, I would say, is hopefully the translation work gets done, it gets published, the negotiation with the publisher is okay. I think my work is I hope so, will help to shape the make it more influential in this neck of the woods. That's what I hope so.
Right. Well, would you like to give us, Wai-chew, would you like to give us your second reading?
Okay. Thank you. So this one is the one, the story is titled Black Bear, and it is the one that involves these two protagonists who have to go and check on the traps. So I just write about this. This is the part where she has a bit of recollection. She's on sentry duty and she thinks about what she sacrificed. I'll read a bit in Chinese as well. 趴掌放哨的任务就是守护，就是瞭望和倾听。往往在这时刻，除了听着外部民众的幽静，炎华也听到自己骚动的内心。那些黄叶般飘落的记忆，在地表蜷曲着，然后微软锈烂，消融为生命的腐殖质。一只无命的昆虫的搅动，往事在脑海里翻了个身。The essence of sentry duty was the protection of others, keeping eyes and ears peeled and ready. But as always when she did her duty, Yan Hao listened not only to the outside world, she also listened to the unrest in her heart, the memories fluttering like yellow leaves falling to the ground, and then the blades and petioles curling and softening, withering and decomposing, becoming the humus or compost that itself sustained a new cycle of life. A nameless insect stirred in her consciousness. It suddenly flipped around. This battle green uniform, for a decade now it had been her regular item of clothing. Her own partner was killed 5 years ago. This was during the 20-month-long siege led by joint Thai-Malaysian forces. 5 years ago now, with so many trials and ordeals in the interim. She didn't have a single photograph of him, not even a snippet of one. In her were layers upon layers of him, her reminiscences of a man taken in his prime, her partner, who was only 29 when he died. Contrastingly, and no matter where she searched, there was another remembrance, another memory that couldn't really take shape. A year before they joined the struggle, she had gotten pregnant. Together with her partner, they managed to evade the encirclement forces and made it to a safe area village. With great effort, she successfully brought the pregnancy to term. But during that tempestuous period, no one could have the child by their side. How could that be possible? So the day after he was born, they sent him out of the village, gave him to another family, to the masses, as they said. The boy who was already 10 years old, where was he? How did he look like? In her memory was only the tiny rose-tinted features of a newborn child, and coming with him into the world, mixed in with his bawling, the alloyed joy and grief of his parents. Thank you.
That's lovely, thanks. And Daniel, would you like to do your second reading?
Yeah, absolutely. I should probably just preface this because I didn't actually yet really talk about Payeras' role as an ecologist, I realized. So I should probably just preface it with a few remarks about that. And also just to say that one of the reasons I came to Payeras was because I've been writing this book that Nicky mentioned at the start about the translation of guerrilla literature, Anglophone poetry networks. So and Payeras is one of the main figures in that account. And so I've known about him for years, but I sort of decided to start working on him more seriously because I was interested in the theoretical angle of his essay, Latitude of Flower and Hail, which is a lay essay that he wrote that's very concerned with the sort of the environmental politics of anti-colonial struggle is a way of saying it. And it's a kind of lyrical essay, but it also gives an ecological history of Guatemala from that point of view. And playing around with one of these guerrilla tropes, which I didn't mention, which is sort of the idea that when the social revolution happens, that all of nature will also rise up, and the jaguars will realize that they were being oppressed as well. And like the green caiman that shapes the island of Cuba will arise and bite the US capitalists and all of the stuff. So Payeras' essay brings these elements together really, really nicely in the way that it interweaves the long social history of Maya resistance to colonization. So first against the Spanish and then later against the Guatemalan state, which has continued to take a basically colonial attitude towards its indigenous communities. And the part I'm going to read here sort of concerns the insurgencies and genocidal reprisals conducted by the state in the Maya areas in the early 1980s, and it connects those with earlier moments of uprising and repression. So there's a sense of sort of historical rhyme. It's happening again. So this is a very, very brief passage, but that sort of conveys that perspective. As this cycle runs out of steam, the environmental dialectic transcends its own sphere and deploys its figures in social life. In the 1970s, suppressed reality flowers in the poor peasants' rebellion. Incubated in silence in secret mountain hideouts, a new uprising spreads rapidly across the northeast. Approaching 1980, the paths once more bristled with traps, and the brief lightning of ambushes thundered at the crossroads. Now, the arsenal includes weapons that make use of gunpowder. For the Indian peoples, it is not, this time, a matter of making yet another attempt to find the old Pashil road, but rather, it is the first effort to remake the world with their own hands. And I would just say about that as well as this sort of insistence on indigenous political agency, Payeras is at the same time a serious ecologist. So as Wai-chew was saying, he's sort of blending the kind of objective zoological traditions of Europe with an interest in indigenous traditions. One of his last works is actually a study of the migration patterns of the peregrine falcon in the Central American Isthmus, which is really kind of a very serious scientific study. So he's blending art with science and kind of exploring those tensions and contradictions in quite a comparable way, I think.
That's extremely interesting. And the comparisons, the similarities and differences between these two writers is also fascinating. We've got just a few minutes left, and I wondered if you'd like to say anything to each other or ask each other anything. All the things we thought we'd talk about, we haven't managed to cover all of it. There probably isn't time now, but I'd love it if you just jumped in with some more comments.
Can I ask? Can I jump in? Yeah,
please do.
Daniel, that term that jumped out at me. Environmental dialectic. Would it encompass, for instance, let's say, they're concerned with interspecies relationships, the human and the more than human world. Is there a sense in which I can't understand what it might mean, environmental dialectic? Could it mean something like the idea that if you have intra-species hierarchies, you can't have an interspecies relationship. So at some level, your concern for the environment leads you to question some of this. This can be gender hierarchies. This can be patriarchal chauvinistic hierarchies, and does that sound like something that could fall under environmental dialectic?
Yeah, thank you. Amazing question. It's a really problematic term that I've been super interested in, and I think I would just preface this by saying that this question of hierarchy in general is up for grabs, isn't it? Because you go to the jungle thinking that you're going to erase the social hierarchies, and then you have military hierarchies that supplant them. And I didn't mention the kind of gender question. I forgot to respond to that, but there's a lot to say in the Latin American context there as well, in terms of women going to the jungle and finding that they don't have to do their domestic chores anymore, and they actually start studying. They're studying and reading more in these contexts than they are at home. So there are accounts that kind of raise those sorts of questions. But then in terms of like inter and trans species stuff, I think that what Payeras means by environmental dialectic is that he's been immersed in sort of Engels above all, and Engels is essay from the 1880s called The Dialectics of Nature, and he's thinking about a kind of historical materialism that sort of produces nature and is also produced by it in turn. So it's that kind of two-way movement, trying to get rid of the human non-human binary, I suppose, but also sort of reading the relation with that environment in materialist terms rather than idealist terms, I suppose, because he is as he says in that poem that I read out, he's still a kind of ragged Bolshevik at the end of the day. So I think it's a critical engagement with Marxism, and one that lots of scholars have made, right, and sort of rethinking Marx's comments about soil exhaustion and and the way that Engels tries to take up the ecological question in Marx and tries to sort of to sort of qualify some of the kind of socialist modernity stuff, which is just as extractive as capitalist modernity, right? As we were saying earlier, with a more sensitive and sustainable way of living in these environments. There's not as much about. I mean, there's loads about species in general, but there isn't I don't think there's as much about species ethics per se as it sounds like there is in Han Payeras. That's interesting. Yeah. But it's a great question. I'm glad you.
I mean, this has been a really lovely and enriching discussion, and has made me want to go away and read much more of both these authors. And I wish we had another hour to carry on talking, but we don't. So I think I'd like to thank both of you very much indeed. And it's been a great occasion. I shall look forward to seeing it online and listening to it again.
Thank you very much, Nicky. Thanks for you.
Thank you, Nicky. Thank you.